Hi, I'm Doug Draper with Acme Distribution and the Denver Transportation Club, and I am pleased to present our series, Supply Chain and Logistics, the Storytellers. The series is brought to you by Cap Logistics. Cap Logistics are experts offering you customized transportation solutions for every need. So please visit caplogistics.com today. So today's topic I'm pretty excited about. It's going to be related to a recent bankruptcy with an LTL carrier up in the Northeast. You may have heard that New England Motor Freight filed for bankruptcy in February. And our guest to talk a little bit about that and elaborate on the implications is Bill Cassidy. He's the senior editor for trucking at the Journal of Commerce. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Doug, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
That's great. So before we get into our topic, we always like to learn a little bit about our storyteller. So, Bill, if you don't mind giving us a little history of yourself, kind of where you're from and what you do specifically for the Journal now, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm senior editor for trucking and surface transportation at the Journal of Commerce.
Mm-hmm.
The Journal of Commerce goes back to 1827 in New York. It used to be a daily newspaper, and some of your listeners may remember that. Today, we're a business intelligence service, providing intelligence to shippers primarily through our news outlets, the online website, the magazine, but also events and increasingly actual individual consultation. So it's a business that's evolved rapidly in the past 10 to 20 years, mm-hmm. and continues to grow strong. I'm originally from New York, and I've been covering trucking in one way or another since 1984, when I first joined a magazine called Fleet Owner.
Okay.
Since then, I've worked for Transport Topics and Traffic World, and now the Journal of Commerce.
Nice. Well, thanks for that introduction. So before we talk about what happened with the bankruptcy, maybe we start with just a little history of New England Motor Freight here in the Colorado market. The detail and scope of their operation may not be as well known. So talk a little bit about the history, areas of operation, revenues, things of that nature, if you don't mind.
Sure. New England Motor Freight, or NEMF, was one of the real old-time LTL trucking companies. It had a long history in the New York, New Jersey area, going back, They claimed to 1918. A little bit hard to document that, but apparently the original company hauled freight for a business known as the National Biscuit Company.
Okay.
Which eventually became Nabisco.
Oh, okay.
So, they went through several changes of ownership, I believe, before they were acquired by a businessman named Myron or Mike Chevelle in 1977. Mm-hmm. And he named the operation New England Motor Freight, and from there grew the company that unfortunately went bankrupt last month. They operated in about 15 northeastern and mid-Atlantic and Midwest states. I mean, they had terminals and hauled freight as far west as Chicago and a little bit beyond. They also interlined with a lot of other carriers. So in terms of their size, they were the 21st largest U.S. less-than-truckload trucking company mm-hmm. last year. And they had been bigger a few years ago. They dropped on that list of top 25 LTL carriers from about 18, a few years ago to 21 last year.
Right.
And their revenue, of course, had been dropping. Mm-hmm. But they had about 3,500 employees total in 11 there were in about 11 operations. The Chevelle family owned the company and had 10 other related companies as subsidiaries. But NEMF was their core business. About 1,900 of their employees were union members, and that's part of the story, too.
Gotcha. The 10 other entities, I'm assuming they're all logistics and transportation related, brokerage divisions, warehousing, things of that nature?
For the most part, there were a couple of oddities, like a solar equipment company that was related to NEMF, other types of trucking or logistics or warehousing businesses. Gotcha. Two of them have survived this and are in line to be sold. Mm-hmm. The rest of them are shutting down.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's jump into the question at hand, and I'll simply say, what the heck happened? You know, it's a group that's been around for close to a decade. So talk about that, just big picture. What did happen?
Sure, you know, that's been hard to piece together, largely because they're a private company and they don't release financial data, never have. They've always been a close company in terms of sharing information. But up until recently, they had been doing, or had been thought to be doing, fairly well. They opened up a new terminal in West Virginia just in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a sign that, you know, they were still in expansion mode just 3 years ago. But the past 3 years apparently hit them fairly hard. The company gave its own explanation in the bankruptcy filing, which is probably the best we're going to get from anyone involved with the company itself. And they referred to a downward trend over recent years. That was exacerbated in late 2018 by the unexpected loss of key accounts. They also blamed the shortage of drivers and a new union contract with onerous retroactive terms. You know, but on top of that, they had 13 letters of credit with 5 different banks.
Okay.
And those letters of credit were coming due in March and April. And at the end of the day, those banks refused to renew the letters of credit. And that tells you that those banks did not see a way forward for that company in a reorganization or a recovery plan. So all those things add together to create the backdrop for that bankruptcy.
Right.
But when you look at it and you see the loss of key accounts, I mean, that is a pretty telling incident too. You know, that they're losing key customers.
Right, right. So would the loss of key customers referred to kind of as bad contracts where they were just underbid and the type of service and work that they were required to do, whether that's white glove or final mile type of thing, is that related to when you say that they lost business? Could the contract relationship have an impact, I guess is my question.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, it's not easy to say who the customers were. You know, there were a lot of indications, a lot of discussions on background with others in the industry who pointed out that this was quite likely a large e-commerce related customer. And there's been a big shift, and this bankruptcy highlights the shift within trucking, within LTL trucking in particular. More and more business that LTL carriers are pursuing is e-commerce related.
Sure.
And that's largely because, unlike the full truckload carriers, if you're an e-commerce retailer, you don't have to wait to build a full truckload. And constant replenishment is always on your mind. You know, we become accustomed to the 2-day fulfillment promise of Amazon Prime. And that's filtering down through not just e-commerce online shoppers, but businesses as well. So more and more e-retailers and businesses are looking at LTL as a way to move e-commerce freight more quickly and get it to, you know, the drop points where you're going to then deliver it to the final mile.
Yeah.
You know, delivery service. So, but there's a problem there because LTL historically, you know, their main core business has been serving manufacturers. So rather than taking big loads of imports from China at the U.S. ports, I mean, they're picking up pallets of goods at, you know, industrial distribution centers or at manufacturing plants and delivering those through their own terminal network to the end customer, which usually was a manufacturer or a store. You know, so now they're getting all this new type of freight. And the real problem becomes, how do you cost it? How do you know what it costs you to actually move this freight?
Sure.
And what's the charge for it? And that's where a lot of companies are, you know, having difficulty. And this may be what caught NEMF in the end. Indications are they had a big contract and they bid for it, they took it, and they found out that the cost of actually handling the business made them unprofitable. And then when they dropped that, or when they were dropped, there was nothing to replace that gaping hole.
Right.
So there's a lesson perhaps about how much freight you take from a major customer, and also the need to know what it really costs. And the companies that know their costs in LTL do very, very well. So this looks like an anomaly in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly not going to change the consumer buying habit. So I would think it's going to be an interesting time for a lot of LTL carriers and final mile participants, especially in a union wage scale. I could see this having some interesting implications with other customers, other service providers in the upcoming years.
Yeah, they're all trying to figure it out, and I think that's really important for your listeners in your market area. This is not just limited to one carrier on the East Coast. Every major carrier, from FedEx Freight down, is trying to figure out how e-commerce fits into the LTL trucking model, and scheme.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been easy.
Yeah, for sure. So a little bit of the history of what happened, but so what happens to the market in absorbing this, right? So it's the 21st largest LTL provider in the country. They're no longer there. How is the market going to absorb all this extra, not even capacity, all this extra volume that's hitting the network now? How do you see that playing out?
Well, it's certainly made things very tight for shippers in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. There are about 4 other major carriers that were competitors of NEMF. There's Pitt, Ohio, A. Dewey Pyle, and New Penn were the 3 big competitors to NEMF. If you combined all their revenue together, those 4 companies, it was about $1.6 billion last year, and NEMF had about 20% of that. So that's a pretty big chunk of change in that marketplace. And that's not just the internal stuff that flows within the Northeast, though they did handle a lot of that. It's also, there is the market that's interregional. It's LTL goods that are originating in the Northeast, moving into the Southeast or the Midwest or the West, and the same happening in reverse. And there are a lot of companies in that market. ODFL, that's Old Dominion Freight Lines in North Carolina, Saia in Georgia, which has been expanding into the Northeast in the past 2 years, opening terminals like crazy. So there was some renewed competition already in the Northeast, which may have helped push NEMF out. But from what I've heard, that's being adjusted as we speak. The bigger impact is in the Northeast, but there's a ripple effect that goes out, and it diminishes the farther out you get.
Yeah.
As companies in the West, in the Midwest, in California begin to, adjust and look for new partners, they're changing their networks to connect with new companies in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic who can fill that gap left by NEMF.
Right. So just as a point of perspective, maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, explain the interline concept where you're buying something in the Northeast, but New England Motor Freight is not making the delivery in Denver. So talk a little bit about the interline piece so our listeners understand that.
Sure. Regional LTL carriers often have partnerships. Once they get to a certain size and they begin accepting national freight, they develop partnerships with regional carriers in other parts of the country, and they can compete with the big national carriers such as YRC Freight or FedEx Freight, XPO Logistics. So a company like NEMF had numerous partnerships across the country. AAA Cooper was one in the South. In Canada, they worked with Manitoulin. So they had, large network of carriers who would move their freight, and to the customer, it would look as if it was one bill, one bill of lading.
Right.
They weren't being charged one bill by NEMF and then another by AAA Cooper or another trucking company. It just all came through from NEMF. And the same would have been true for the customers in the Southeast or in the West who would be using their partner carriers. So that's how the interline operation works within the LTL model.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about what maybe maybe liquidation process isn't the right term, but business just doesn't stop on one day. You know, this announcement I think was February 12th. So business didn't stop February 13th because there was shipments in transit and contracts that need to be winded down. So talk a little bit about how that transition happens to have the business wind down.
Right. Well, you know, the major point for NEMF or any other company in that situation is to have the workers there to keep the freight moving, to keep the terminals open until all of the freight has been delivered finally. And, you know, in order to do that, you know, they had to go to their union, just the International Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union, and basically come up with an agreement. They were sued directly after the announcement by the union for violating the WARN Act, which requires 60 days notice before a plant closure. Mm-hmm. They did settle. They agreed to some pay conditions the union sought. So they have had people on hand to make that orderly transition. You know, that they said that at the time that it would take 2 to 3 weeks, and probably that has been completed by this point or is very close to completion. I certainly haven't heard any reports of, you know, freight being stranded, as has happened in past bankruptcies. So I give them credit for having the foresight to do it in this fashion. Other companies in the past that went bankrupt without a lot of notice, you know, often shippers had to wait weeks to get freight, and
right.
It was a very, very costly process.
Gotcha. So
for the assets, I was going to say for the assets, Doug, you know, they only owned like one of the properties. This is one of the interesting things about the overall structure. I mean, the Chevelle Family Trust or the Chevelle Development Trust, I believe, owned a lot of the assets in terms of property. So they had 35 terminals in 15 states, and I believe they were all leased properties. A lot of their rolling stock, their trucks and trailers were leased as well.
Okay.
You know, so they apparently are most likely auctioning off a lot of the rolling stock. You know, it's there. I don't know the age of their fleet, but everything I have heard says that they had some older equipment. It had been hanging on to it, obviously, as the costs rose. You know, one of the catch-22 situations there is, you know, if you've got a fleet of old trucks, new trucks may be expensive, but so is maintenance.
Right.
So as those trucks age, your costs still rise. So I'm sure they felt pressure there. But apparently they have been, you know, in the process of disposing of all those assets.
Got it. You made mention, one of the questions that I had is lawsuits, right? And you made mention of that related to the WARN Act and the union coming out. Is that the only, and it sounds like they've come to an amicable resolution. Is that the case? And is there any other lawsuits that generally happen during a bankruptcy that we haven't seen yet?
That's the case in terms of the, you know, the employee lawsuit. But certainly, I think we can expect there's going to be some action from their creditors, from the companies they owe money to as yet. You know, it all depends on how the bankruptcy proceeding unfolds in court. What's interesting is this is a Chapter 11 liquidation. Mm-hmm. You know, Chapter 11 is usually a reorganization, but they obviously decided fairly early on that they weren't going to be able to do that and went to a liquidation process. But Chapter 11 may help them dispose of some of that debt and, you know, fulfill their obligations more quickly, perhaps.
Gotcha. Yeah, one of the thoughts was any unique or noteworthy situations in the actual filing, and I think you may have answered that one, where normally a liquidation is Chapter 7, but you said this was Chapter 11. This may be a little bit out of the scope of your consulting, but do you know why it was that set up that way?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that, you know, they initially were looking at a reorganization. Mm-hmm. They mentioned the bankruptcy filing. And when the officer in charge of this, they hired someone to come in and look at the finances and try and reorganize the company. This all unfolded apparently very quickly. One of the banks, I think one of their creditors, refused to renew a line of credit in late January. And at that point, they had to make a decision. And it was probably, okay, we're going out rather than reorganizing. So I think that was very interesting. And again, to have 13 letters of credit and 5 banks, and none of the banks wanted to renew the letters of credit. Mm-hmm. It's to me, that's very unusual. YRC Worldwide almost went bankrupt in 2009. One of the major stories of the past decade, really, is the fact that they survived and managed through restructuring of debt, sacrifices by their union members, the Teamsters accepting a 15% wage cut. They managed to survive. Roadrunner, another large LTL operator, with Roadrunner Freight as one of its core subsidiaries. It's gone through this massive restructuring after having to restate earnings for a period of 3 years and, firing, basically replacing all of its management. They recently went through a rights offering and now are majority owned by the Elliott venture capital firm, mm-hmm. Elliott Management. So they've survived. Why NEMF and its creditors couldn't come to some type of arrangement? This was not a small company. It had significant assets. Why it was decided that we're not going to try and keep this company going is a question I have, which has not been answered. And, this is a case probably where it just wasn't big enough to be too big to fail.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting comment, but it definitely makes sense hearing you recap everything. So being our audience out here in Colorado, just in a couple minutes that we have left, so what would that mean for the average consumer or company here in Colorado, this bankruptcy? You said a ripple effect, and the wave that was felt on the Northeast may not be so substantial out here in Colorado. What thoughts do you have for the implications for people in Colorado?
Well, I think the direct implications from NEMF going out of business probably aren't too big. The companies that had been using NEMF through partnerships will probably find another partner and be able to fill in the gap. It might be a little bit of disruption. They might have to pay more to their new partner. Mm-hmm. Certainly the prices in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, those LTL prices are likely, they're not dropping anyway. They're probably heading up. They were heading up already, not as fast as last year, but still going up. This gives a bit more impetus for higher LTL rates in the Northeast. Does that spread to the entire country? Maybe it's a fraction of a percent. But I think the bigger thing is, if you're engaged in some way in shipping and you're looking at the health of companies, we had one shipper call us and say, how many other LTL companies like this are out there where we don't know how they're doing financially because they're privately owned, right, and they could be on the brink? I think the answer probably is not too many. One of the strange things about this is, that last year was a really good year to be an LTL trucker. They had, overall, the industry broke the $40 billion barrier for the first time. I think the total industry had $42 billion mm-hmm. in revenue, and the top 25 had about $38 or $39 billion in revenue. But I think the important thing is to look at your supplier, your partner, and talk to them about margins and costing. Mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of companies in the LTL business that historically have run on very tight margin.
Right. Yeah.
And if they don't know their costs and they run into a contract situation with a customer, as NEMF apparently did with some accounts, where suddenly they're charging much too less to haul the freight than they should. they're likely to suffer. They could suffer a similar fate. So, and that is something that customers of these companies should be concerned about and should be watching.
Right. Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see the unintended consequences of what's transpiring out there. So, Bill, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I think it was excellent to learn a little bit more about what's happening out there on the East Coast with NEMF. And again, thank you for joining us today on the Connect and Collaborate Network featuring supply chain and logistics, the Storytellers. It's brought to you by Cap Logistics. Again.